Start Hour 18, page 554. Dismantling domestic and international criminal enterprises. Criminal organizations are as old as crime itself, but are more extensive, sophisticated, and dangerous today than at any other point in history. The Department of Justice has a key role in tackling transnational criminal organizations like Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, and Mexican drug cartels, as well as purely domestic criminal organizations like those built on the more traditional mafia crime model, as part of its obligation to ensure the safety and security of the American people. The department's primary directive under the next administration should be to return to an unapologetic focus on dismantling these criminal organizations and incarcerating their membership. Once this reprioritization occurs, the department's political leadership should take concrete steps to use agency reach and resources to prevent these criminal organizations from operating and surviving. Assaulting the business model of these criminal organizations, which are massive, diversified enterprises with nationwide or international operations, is essential for success. The next administration will therefore need to revitalize the DOJ's use of the array of statutory tools that exist for dealing with the threat of criminal organizations. The most potent ones are the simplest. For example, the department should 1. Rigorously prosecute as much interstate drug activity as possible, including simple possession of distributable quantities. Recent efforts to create the impression that drug possession crimes are not serious offenses has contributed to the explosion of criminal organization activities in the United States. 2. Aggressively deploy the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, which Congress expressly created to empower the Department of Justice to treat patterns of interstate-level crimes, such as robbery, extortion, and murder, as federal criminal conduct for criminal organizations and networks. The next administration can use existing tools while it works with Congress to develop new tools. Secure the border, which is the key entry point for many criminal organizations and their supplies, products, and employees. Mexico, which is arguably functioning as a failed state run by drug cartels, is the main point of transit for illegal drugs produced in Central and South America, fentanyl precursors from the Chinese Communist Party, led People's Republic of China, weapons, human smuggling and trafficking, and other contraband. Mexican drug cartels, including the dominant Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, CJNG, are the main drivers of fentanyl production and distribution in the United States. The southwestern land border is sufficiently porous that Mexican drug cartels have operational control of large sections of the border, which facilitates easy movement of product and personnel. These cartels are also violent and not afraid to demonstrate force on both sides of the border. Their conduct represents a clear and present danger to the United States and its citizens. In addition to finalizing the southwestern land border wall, the next administration should take a creative and aggressive approach to tackling these dangerous criminal organizations at the border. This could include use of active-duty military personnel and National Guardsmen to assist in arrest operations along the border, something that has not yet been done. A new and forceful approach to interdiction will have a ripple effect on the operations of these criminal organizations, which currently operate freely without concern for criminal prosecution, and will lay the necessary groundwork for initial prosecutions of these organizations and their leaders. It is critical that the federal government staunch the flow of drugs by preventing the far too easy access to the United States that now exists. There can be no serious dispute that the Biden administration has opened the southwest border to whomever wants to enter, and that some of those entrants are smuggling fentanyl into the country. More than 100,000 Americans died in a one-year period from opioid overdoses, and many of them died specifically from having used fentanyl. The federal government should treat this problem as aggressively as necessary. Enforcing the customs and immigration laws is a matter of life and death. Pursuing a national security agenda aimed at external state and non-state actors, not U.S. citizens exercising their constitutional rights. The Department of Justice plays a vital role in protecting our national security, and it must not refrain from engaging in public initiatives that identify our adversaries and educate the American people about their activities. The DOJ's China initiative under President Trump reflected the department's priority of combating Chinese threats to our national security. Because China was accountable for approximately 80% of all prosecutions for economic espionage and approximately 60% of all thefts of trade secrets, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions set key goals for the China initiative that included development of an enforcement strategy concerning researchers in labs and universities who were being co-opted into stealing critical U.S. technologies, identification of opportunities to address supply chain threats more effectively, and education of colleges and universities about potential threats from Chinese influence efforts on campus. In February 2022, the Biden administration terminated the department's China initiative largely out of a concern for poor optics. While the Biden administration correctly identified China as America's only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and, increasingly, the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it, it folded in the face of political correctness and sent the message that liberal sensitivities outweighed bringing justice to threats from China. The next conservative administration should therefore restart the China initiative. Pursue other programs to educate the American people about the real and dangerous threats to our national security and economic security that are posed by actors across the globe, most notably China and Iran. Ensure that it is agile enough to devote sufficient resources and attention to other emerging threats that involve federal interests such as increases in sextortion, ransomware, and the continued proliferation of child pornography. Defending the rule of law. The DOJ's actions over the course of the Biden administration exhibit scorn for its stated mission to uphold the rule of law, to keep our country safe, and to protect civil rights. The Biden administration's unprecedented politicization and weaponization of the department therefore demand a comprehensive response from the next administration. Restoration of the department's values of independence, impartiality, honesty, integrity, respect, and excellence must serve as first principles for its efforts on all fronts. Concretely, the DOJ must identify and address all individuals, policies, and directives that have fueled the destruction of these core values and the American people's loss of trust in the department and its officials. The next administration will need to exert significant energy to dismantle the two-tiered system of justice currently in place at the department while simultaneously applying the rule of law evenly and with neutrality. Specific examples of department corruption, such as the Russia collusion hoax, will need to be tackled, exposed, and addressed head-on. This will require not just winning in a court of law, but also demonstrating culpability to the public and the media in a concrete and non-refutable manner. These efforts will require commitment and willpower, but they will be essential to restoring the trust of the American people. Promptly and properly eliminating lawless policies, investigations, and cases, including all existing consent decrees. Few things undermine the DOJ's credibility more than brazenly partisan and ideologically driven prosecution of an administration's perceived political enemies. Yet the department has readily indulged in such misadventures during the Biden administration. Before even entering the Robert F. CT a thorough review of all publicly available policies, investigations, and cases. In a manner consistent with applicable law, prepare a plan to end immediately any policies, investigations, or cases that run contrary to law or administration policies. Ensure that upon the next president's inauguration, appointees at the department obtain information about anything that was not learned before taking office and conduct the same analysis. An egregious example of the need for such a review is provided by the department's use of the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances (FACE) Act to harass pro-life demonstrators while not pursuing similar investigations of shocking acts of violence committed against pro-life pregnancy resource centers. On the morning of September 23, 2022, pro-life activist Mark Houck was arrested by more than 15 FBI agents at his home in Pennsylvania in front of his wife and small children. Agents came to his door with guns drawn to arrest the 48-year-old father of 7 whose alleged crime involved a minor altercation with an activist who was harassing one of his children in front of an abortion clinic almost 1 year before Mr. Houck's arrest by the FBI. Similarly, Paul Vaughn, a 55-year-old father of 11, was arrested at his home in Mt. Juliet, Tennessee, by armed FBI agents for allegedly participating in a peaceful protest at an abortion clinic 1 year earlier. These arrests stand in stark contrast to the department's virtual silence on the wave of vandalism and violence directed at religiously affiliated institutions, including pregnancy resource centers, following the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. The Catholic News Agency reported more than 100 such incidents as of September 2022. By engaging in disparate and viewpoint-based enforcement of an already controversial law like the FACE Act against pro-life activists, the DOJ has needlessly undermined its credibility with law-abiding people of faith. The department should make every effort to uphold equal protection of the law and avoid politically motivated and viewpoint-based prosecutions. Specifically, it should ensure that its review extends beyond ending the absurd double standards embodied in the ongoing campaign of FACE Act prosecutions and instead be a thorough and holistic review of all DOJ activities, including all consent decrees and settlement agreements currently in force. Seek to terminate any unnecessary or outdated consent decree to which the United States is a party. Consider pursuing intervention in other matters where consent decrees or settlement agreements continue to bind parties years or decades after the fact. As its review concludes, and consistent with applicable law, take appropriate action in all cases, including those on appeal. Enact policies and regulations that prohibit settlement payments to third parties. Engaging in zealous advocacy for and defense of the Constitution and lawful administration regulations and policies. The Department of Justice has the exclusive responsibility for the conduct of litigation in which the United States, an agency, or officer thereof, is involved and has been charged with the supervision of all litigation to which the United States, an agency, or officer thereof is a party. However, in politically contentious cases, assistant United States attorneys and other line prosecutors during conservative administrations seek to influence outcomes of cases not because of any legal deficiency in the case or policy being defended, but by refusing to take certain positions, by writing public letters of protest, and by engaging in faux resignations from certain internal appointments. This can cause the department to take positions that are inconsistent with the interests of the president and his appointees in other places throughout the administration. While the supervision of litigation is a DOJ responsibility, the department falls under the direct supervision and control of the President of the United States as a component of the executive branch. Thus, and putting aside criminal prosecutions that can warrant different treatment, litigation decisions must be made consistent with the president's agenda. This can force line attorneys to take uncomfortable positions in civil cases because those positions are more closely aligned with the president's policy agenda. Ultimately, the department will have to make tough calls as it manages its litigation, but those calls must always be consistent with the president's policy agenda and the rule of law. A line attorney should never either directly or indirectly pursue a policy agenda through litigation that is inconsistent with the agenda of his or her client agency or the president. The department should also be cognizant of any attempts to slow litigation and outlast the administration to avoid finality. The next conservative administration should therefore issue guidance to ensure that litigation decisions are consistent with the president's agenda and the rule of law. Ensure that, consistent with this principle, the department's leadership is prepared to impose appropriate disciplinary action as circumstances arise. Affirming the separation of powers. Federal courts have jurisdiction to deal with a wide array of issues in law and equity in the United States. The increasingly aggressive posture of federal courts does not change one constitutionally immutable fact. All three branches of the federal government retain not just the right, but the obligation to assess constitutionality. It is this obligation that is the foundation of the separation of powers. The next conservative administration should embrace the Constitution and understand the obligation of the executive branch to use its independent resources and authorities to restrain the excesses of both the legislative and judicial branches. This will mean ensuring that the leadership of the Department of Justice and its components understand the separation of powers, that pushback among the branches is a positive feature and not a defect of our system, and that the federal system is strengthened, not weakened, by disagreement among the branches. One example includes potentially seeking the overruling of Humphrey's Executor versus United States. This case approved so-called independent agencies whose directors are not removable by the president at will. The Supreme Court has chipped away at Humphrey's Executor in cases like Sila Law versus Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, 63, but the precedent remains. The next conservative administration should formally take the position that Humphrey's Executor violates the Constitution's separation of powers, zealously guarding other constitutional protections. The next conservative administration must ensure that the DOJ zealously guards the constitutional rights of all Americans in all that it does. This extends not only to rights implicated in the department's criminal activities, but to all rights enjoyed by the American people, such as the First Amendment. The department should reject any invitation to limit these fundamental promises based on the political ideology of the speech at issue. A recent Supreme Court case illustrates the problems that arise when the DOJ takes a cramped interpretation of the First Amendment in service of a political ideology. In 303 Creative LLC v. Elenis, the department argued in favor of the government's ability to coerce and compel what the lower courts all found to be pure speech. The oral argument made clear the department's view that it was the viewpoint expressed that gave the government power to censor and compel speech. During oral argument, the United States took the remarkable position that government can compel a Christian website designer to imagine, create, and publish a custom website celebrating same-sex marriage, but cannot compel an LGBT person to design a similar website celebrating opposite-sex marriage. In the government's view, declining to create the latter website was based on an objection to the message, while the former was based on status rather than message, but this argument inevitably turns on the viewpoint expressed. It means that the government gets to decide which viewpoints are protected and which are not, a frightening and blatantly unconstitutional proposition. Just as troubling, the government's arguments against free speech are not limited to the facts of 303 Creative. As Colorado admitted to the lower courts, all sorts of artists and speakers like speechwriters, photographers, and videographers can be compelled to design custom messages that violate their most fundamental convictions as long as it serves a certain viewpoint that the government wants to promote. In fact, it was only a few years ago, in Masterpiece Cake Shop, that the government acknowledged the constitutional problems involved in compelling artists to speak government-favored messages. In that case, the United States acknowledged a basic First Amendment principle that freedom of speech prohibits the government from telling people what they must say. The department had it right when it argued that the government may not compel the dissemination of its own preferred message because the First Amendment protects the individual freedom of mind. It was also correct when it argued that an artist cannot be forced to paint, a musician cannot be forced to play, and a poet cannot be forced to write. The United States' directly contrary position in 303 Creative is hard to explain based on anything other than its support for the message the state of Colorado was attempting to compel. It is black-letter law that no official can prescribe what shall be orthodox or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. Rather, the First Amendment places the decision as to what views shall be voiced largely into the hands of each of us, in the hope that use of such freedom will ultimately produce a more capable citizenry and more perfect polity. As the Supreme Court has noted, government officials have frequently sought to coerce uniformity of sentiment in support of some end thought essential to their time and country. In the face of such attempts to coerce orthodoxy, the DOJ should maintain its commitment to upholding the Constitution's neutral principles of free speech, which commit the government to preserve an uninhibited marketplace of ideas in which truth will ultimately prevail. Pursuing equal protection for all Americans by vigorously enforcing applicable federal civil rights laws in government, education, and the private sector. Entities across the private and public sectors in the United States have been besieged in recent years by an unholy alliance of special interests, radicals in government, and the far left. This unholy alliance speaks in platitudes about advancing the interests of certain segments of American society, but that advancement comes at the expense of other Americans and in nearly all cases violates long-standing federal law. Even though numerous federal laws prohibit discrimination based on notable immutable characteristics such as race and sex, the Biden administration, through the DOJ's Civil Rights Division and other federal entities, has enshrined affirmative discrimination in all aspects of its operations under the guise of equity. Federal agencies and their components have established so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion, DI, offices that have become the vehicles for this unlawful discrimination, and all departments and agencies have created equity plans to carry out these invidious schemes. To reverse this trend, the next conservative administration should ensure that the DOJ spearheads an initiative demonstrating the federal government's commitment to non-discrimination. The department should also lead a whole-of-government recommitment to non-discrimination and should be working with all other federal agencies, boards, and commissions to ensure that they are both complying with constitutional and legal requirements and using their authorities and funding to prevent discrimination not only internally, but also at the state, local, and private sector levels. This will require particularly close coordination with several key agencies, including such obvious candidates as the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Departments of Defense, Education and Housing and Urban Development, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. It will also require enforcing contractual requirements that prohibit discrimination on federal contractors. Reorganize and refocus the DOJ's Civil Rights Division to serve as the vanguard for this return to lawfulness. The Attorney General and other DOJ political leadership should provide the resources and moral support needed for these efforts. The Civil Rights Division should spend its first year under the next administration using the full force of federal prosecutorial resources to investigate and prosecute all state and local governments, institutions of higher education, corporations, and any other private employers who are engaged in discrimination in violation of constitutional and legal requirements. Announcing a campaign to enforce the criminal prohibitions in 18 U.S. Code Sections 1461 and 1462 against providers and distributors of abortion pills that use the mail. Federal law prohibits mailing a very article, instrument, substance, drug, medicine, or thing which is advertised or described in a manner calculated to lead another to use or apply it for producing abortion. Following the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs, there is now no federal prohibition on the enforcement of this statute. The Department of Justice in the next conservative administration should therefore announce its intent to enforce federal law against providers and distributors of such pills. Reassigning responsibility for prosecuting election-related offenses from the Civil Rights Division to the Criminal Division. The Attorney General in the next conservative administration should reassign responsibility for prosecuting violations of 18 U.S. Code Section 24176 from the Civil Rights Division to the Criminal Division where it belongs. Otherwise, voter registration fraud and unlawful ballot correction will remain federal election offenses that are never appropriately investigated and prosecuted. Voter fraud includes unlawful practices concerning voter registration and ballot correction. When state legislatures are silent as to procedures for absentee ballot curing or provide specific rules governing that curing, neither counties nor courts may create a cure right where one does not exist, may not modify the law on curing, and certainly cannot engage in creating consent orders with the force of law that are inconsistent with the orders of other similarly situated counties. The DOJ has ceded substantial discretion concerning voter suppression to the Civil Rights Division. Since the Bush administration, DOJ leadership has determined that using the Election Crimes Branch to prosecute fraudulent voter registration, including mail-in ballot fraud, was too politically costly. The Criminal Division's Federal Prosecution of Election Offenses Handbook advised that schemes that violated equal protection constituted voter suppression, prosecutable under 18 U.S. Code Section 241 as part of the guidelines for which the department's criminal prosecutors were trained. State-based investigations of election crimes are supposed to be referred to the Public Integrity Section for review. Historically, 18 U.S. Code Section 241, Conspiracy Against Rights, was used as a basis for investigating state officials whose statements or orders violated the equal protection rights of voters or deliberately misinformed voters concerning the eligibility of their ballots. Nevertheless, the Department of Justice has formalized the Civil Rights Divisions, as opposed to the Criminal Division's, jurisdiction over 18 U.S. Code Section 241 investigations and prosecutions. The Criminal Division is no longer involved in consultation or review of 18 U.S. Code Section 241 investigations. The Criminal Division has accordingly advised states that, in the case of a crime of violence or intimidation, they should call 911 immediately and before contacting federal authorities because state and local police have primary jurisdiction over polling places, despite clearly applicable federal law. This is a mistake. With respect to the 2020 presidential election, there were no DOJ investigations of the appropriateness or lawfulness of state election guidance. Consider the state of Pennsylvania. The Secretary of State sent guidance to the counties stating that this revised guidance addresses the issuance, voting, and examination of provisional ballots under the Election Code. Provisional ballots were originally mandated by Section 302 of the Help America Vote Act of 2002, HAVA. Provisional ballot amendments included in Act 77 of 2019 went into effect for the 2020 primary election. Provisional ballot amendments included in Act 12 of 2020 go into effect for the first time on November 3, 2020. HAVA, however, mandates provisional ballots only for eligible voters who are not on a state's voter registration list. It does not apply to those who registered for mail-in voting, but whose ballots were rejected due to some form of spoliation. Pennsylvania Act 12, amended in 2020, does not authorize curing by providing provisional ballots for mail-in voters whose ballots were rejected. Act 12 requires, as part of the mail-in application process, an affidavit that the elector shall not be eligible to vote at a polling place on election day unless the elector brings the elector's mail-in ballot to the elector's polling place, remits the ballot and the envelope containing the declaration of the elector to the judge of elections to be spoiled, and signs a statement subject to the penalties under 18 TTS. Section 4904, relating to unsworn falsification to authorities, to the same effect. The law in Pennsylvania clearly states that no county may affirmatively provide provisional ballots. The mail-in voter must vote in person and sign a new affidavit. In the 2020 election, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court recognized that the election code contains no requirement that voters whose ballots are deemed inadequately verified be apprised of this fact. Thus, unlike in-person voters, mail-in or absentee voters are not provided any opportunity to cure perceived defects in a timely manner. Given the Pennsylvania Secretary of State's use of guidance to circumvent state law, the Pennsylvania Secretary of State should have been, and still should be, investigated and prosecuted for potential violations of 18 U.S. Code Section 241. Investigations and prosecutions under 18 U.S. Code Section 241 are currently within the jurisdictional oversight of the Civil Rights Division, not the Criminal Division. Only by moving authority for 18 U.S. Code Section 241 investigations and prosecutions back to the Criminal Division will the rule of law be appropriately enforced. Rejecting third-party requests for politically motivated investigations or prosecutions. The DOJ should reject demands from third-party groups that ask it to threaten politically motivated investigation or prosecution of those engaging in lawful and, in many cases, constitutionally protected activity. By acceding to such demands, the department risks diminishing its credibility with the American public. This risk is exacerbated by the fact that communications between government officials and third-party groups are generally unprotected by privilege and subject to disclosure, whether via subpoena to the third-party group or via request made pursuant to the Freedom of Information Act. These communications can even be made public voluntarily by the third-party group. A recent example illustrates the risks posed by such activity. On October 4, 2021, Attorney General Merrick Garland issued a memorandum to the Director of the FBI, the Executive Office for U.S. Attorneys, and the Assistant Attorney General, Criminal Division, calling on the FBI to work with each U.S. attorney to convene meetings with federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial leaders to discuss strategies for addressing threats against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff. Subsequent reporting and investigation revealed that the memorandum was prompted by a September 29, 2021, letter sent by the National School Boards Association, NSBA, to President Biden demanding a federal law enforcement response to perceived threats to school board members and public school employees. The NSBA letter made outlandish demands in response to protests that were then occurring at school board meetings in response to COVID policies and revelations about the use of critical race theory infused curricula in classrooms. Among the letter's demands was a call for a federal investigation into parents' actions, heinous actions, that could be the equivalent to a form of domestic terrorism and hate crimes under a variety of federal laws including the Gun-Free Zones Act, the Patriot Act in regards to domestic terrorism, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes and Prevention Act, the Violent Interference with Federally Protected Rights Statute, and the Conspiracy Against Rights Statute, and an executive order to enforce all applicable federal laws for the protection of students and public school district personnel, and any related measure. Both the Attorney General's memorandum and the NSBA letter drew swift public condemnation, including from 14 sitting state attorneys general. A subsequent internal investigation commissioned by the NSBA revealed that officials at the White House had been in discussions with NSBA officials about the contents of the letter weeks before it was issued. The investigation also revealed that White House officials indicated they planned to raise the contents of the draft letter with DOJ officials a full week before the NSBA's letter was issued. This cooperation by a third-party group, the White House, and the DOJ to craft and coordinate a response to an ill-advised and politically motivated letter undermines the department's credibility as an impartial law enforcement agency. In the words of the 14 state attorneys general who wrote to oppose the department's memorandum, potential collusion between the White House, the department, and the NSBA in the actual creation of the September 29 letter, as a pretext for threats against parents, raises serious concerns. The DOJ should carefully scrutinize all requests for law enforcement assistance and reject requests by third parties to engage in political grandstanding that ignores the department's traditional jurisdictional limits and that would trample politically controversial but constitutionally protected activity. Ensuring proper distribution of DOJ grant funds. DOJ grants are an underutilized asset in most conservative administrations. When used properly, they can be highly effective in implementing the president's priorities. The Office of Justice Programs, OJP, is comprised of 6 components and is responsible for most DOJ grants to local law enforcement, juvenile justice, and victims of crime as well as for criminal justice research and statistics. The opportunity to support a president's agenda may be greater through OJP grant funding than it is through any of the federal government's other grant-making components. Consistent with appropriations from Congress, the OJP dispenses approximately $7 billion in various grants. Block grants are given to a state to be awarded pursuant to federal regulations. Some funds to support law enforcement and victims of crime are awarded pursuant to block grants. But most OJP funds are awarded through discretionary grants, specific programs written into the budget by Congress. Although Congress dictates the way in which many grant awards are to be made, federal staff enjoy a tremendous amount of discretion in adding conditions and priority points. Grants operate with a carrot and a stick. To receive grant funding, a recipient must agree to certain conditions, which in many instances include the president's priorities. For instance, under an anti-human trafficking grant during the Obama administration, approximately $110 million in 2020, an awardee had to show a partnership with an LGBTQ organization and always have an interpreter on site. These conditions worked to change culture and overlaid President Obama's priorities, support for the LGBTQ community, and for more of the funding to go to areas with large immigrant populations. During the Trump administration, a condition added to grants stated that an awardee had to comply with all federal law, stock language, including federal law regarding the exchange of information between federal and local authorities about an individual's immigration status. This condition prevented law enforcement in sanctuary cities from receiving grant awards. While the Trump administration suffered a series of setbacks from several hostile courts, it obtained from the Second Circuit Court of Appeals a decision upholding the department's authority to impose these conditions. To ensure that taxpayer-funded grants are prioritized and distributed properly, the next conservative administration should conduct an immediate, comprehensive review of all federal grant dispersals to ensure not only that the programs are being properly administered by the department, but also that the grant funding is being received and used properly by recipients. Order an overhaul of the DOJ grant application process to include more rigorous vetting of state, local, and private grant applicants and inclusion of more pre-application criteria to ensure baseline fitness and eligibility for federal grant dollars. This long overdue enhancement of the grant application and issuance process will ensure that hard-earned taxpayer dollars are going only to lawful actors who support federal law enforcement and demonstrate the ability and willingness to engage in lawful activities, ensuring proper enforcement and administration of our immigration laws. Although its role has changed over the years, most notably following the passage of the Homeland Security Act of 2002, the Department of Justice plays a crucial role in the enforcement and adjudication of our immigration laws. Its leadership and energy, however, have not always reflected the importance placed by Congress on the execution of that crucial mission. With a few notable exceptions, successful fulfillment of the department's responsibilities with respect to immigration was largely neglected until the Trump administration. The Department of Homeland Security may be the largest federal department with immigration responsibilities, but successful fulfillment of the responsibilities prescribed by the immigration laws is not possible without bold and dedicated action by the Department of Justice. The DOJ and its leadership must intentionally prioritize fulfillment of the department's immigration-related responsibilities in the next conservative administration. This will be no small task, as these responsibilities play out across nearly every DOJ office and component. If they hope to fulfill their responsibilities as assigned by Congress and deliver results for the American people, the Department and the Attorney General should issue guidance to all U.S. attorneys emphasizing the importance of prosecuting immigration offenses and immigration-related offenses. The brunt of these offenses is borne by districts along the southwestern border with Mexico, but the simple fact remains that immigration and immigration-related offenses are present in every district across the country. Successfully pursuing the priorities outlined in this chapter will require creative use of the various immigration and immigration-related authorities in close partnership with the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of State, and other appropriate federal entities depending on the situation. Pursue appropriate steps to assist the Department of Homeland Security in obtaining information about criminal aliens in jurisdictions across the United States, particularly those inside sanctuary jurisdictions. Examine and consider the appropriateness of withdrawing or overturning every immigration decision rendered by Attorney General Garland and any successor Attorney General during President Biden's term. The Attorney General should pick up where the Attorneys General under President Trump left off and exercise his or her authority to adjudicate cases and provide guidance in appropriate cases to correct erroneous decisions, provide clarity, and align Executive Office for Immigration Review, EOR, decisions with the law. at a minimum, pursue through rulemaking, and in partnership with the Department of Homeland Security where appropriate, the promulgation of every rule related to immigration that was issued during the Trump administration. Such rulemakings include guidance on continuances in immigration court cases, eligibility for asylum, and other related matters. However, the DOJ should not stop there. It should continually evaluate its authorities and operational reality within the immigration court system and promulgate regulations accordingly. Commit sufficient resources to the adjudication of cases in the immigration court system in different environments, for example, in the context of the migrant protection protocols. Pursue proactive litigation to advance the federal government's interests in areas where erroneous precedent curtails authorities provided by Congress, for example, by pursuing the overturning of the Flores Settlement Agreement. Pursue aggressive enforcement of the immigration laws within the Immigrant and Employee Rights section of the Civil Rights Division to ensure that no American citizen is discriminated against in the employment context in favor of a temporary or foreign worker. Ensure the deployment and use of appointees throughout the department who are committed to successful achievement of the department's immigration-related missions. This includes personnel in or overseeing not only the EOR, but also the Office of the Attorney General, Office of the Deputy Attorney General, Office of the Associate Attorney General, Office of the Solicitor General, and nearly every other component/office throughout the department. Pursue a more vigorous anti-fraud program within the EOR. In perhaps no other area of law are there more attorneys who commit acts of fraud against their clients, advancing completely meritless arguments in exchange for exorbitant fees, than there are in the area of immigration. Fraud and unethical behavior are rampant in the immigration system and must be addressed, not only to ensure that the federal government is operating in a proper manner, but also for the sake of the aliens involved in the process as well as the integrity/credibility of the members of the private immigration bar who do not engage in such conduct. Additional essential reforms. Aligning departmental resources with leadership priorities across all components and U.S. attorneys' offices. As the next administration pursues its objectives, it should use the department's resources efficiently in a manner that delivers results for the American people. To accomplish this goal, it will be necessary to ensure the assignment of sufficient political appointees throughout the department. Ensuring adequate accountability throughout the DOJ requires the intentional devotion of sufficient resources by the administration, not simply replicating what was done under prior administrations and reflected in the Plum Book. The number of appointees serving throughout the department in prior administrations, particularly during the Trump administration, has not been sufficient either to stop bad things from happening through proper management or to promote the president's agenda. It is not enough for political appointees to serve in obvious offices like the Office of the Attorney General or the Office of the Deputy Attorney General. The next conservative administration must make every effort to obtain the resources to support a vast expansion of the number of appointees in every office and component across the department, especially in the Civil Rights Division, the FBI, and the EOR. End all non-essential details of department personnel, particularly those detailed to congressional offices, until the department can conduct a thorough review of its personnel needs. Considering all of the many challenges facing the DOJ, the next conservative administration should terminate and recall all details of DOJ personnel shortly after the president's inauguration. After a thorough analysis of the department's resources and priorities is completed, details to other portions of the executive branch and to Congress can resume. Ensure accountability for personnel sanctioned or referred for discipline after a finding of misconduct. The next conservative administration should complete a thorough review of any sanctions or findings of misconduct issued over the 4 years preceding the inauguration to ensure that the Biden administration acted appropriately in response to any such sanctions or findings. Undertake a comprehensive review of DOJ hiring practices. The next conservative administration should conduct a holistic review of hiring practices employed across all DOJ offices and components to ensure that those practices comply with applicable law and policy. All hiring committees associated with hiring for career positions across the department should be assessed for impartiality to ensure that individuals are hired based on merit, aptitude, and legal skill and not based on association with or membership in certain ideologically aligned groups or based on illegal considerations such as race, religion, or sex. Eliminating redundant offices and consolidating functions to increase efficiencies. The next conservative administration should explore the possibility of consolidating and aligning the functions of the DOJ's various components and offices in human resources, legal counsel, public relations, and other related areas. While local access to appropriate personnel and resources is important, there are inefficiencies and redundancies across the department that result in a bureaucratic, Rube Goldberg-style design that ultimately hinders the department's mission. From IT infrastructure to management functions to public relations, DOJ leadership should explore consolidation and intradepartmental efficiencies to obtain the best possible support for its critical missions. For example, the Department of Public Affairs has a dual structure of public information officers in which there are some political appointees who lead the office and provide support, but also career appointees who serve as public information officers for individual divisions, criminal division, national security division, etc. The career officials handle the day-to-day work of the division, which entails monitoring important cases, assisting in editing, and distributing press releases. and the political appointees will step in for larger issues that advance the administration's initiatives. This could be made more efficient by having political appointees for each division under the supervision of the Director of Public Affairs. Additionally, given the interplay of function between the Office of Legislative Affairs, OLE, and the Office of Public Affairs, as well as the fact that the Assistant Attorney General for the OLE is a Senate-confirmed position, the two offices should be folded into one for more efficiency and proper coordination. Under an Office of Public and Legislative Affairs, the Assistant Attorney General's portfolio would encompass both, with one Director/Deputy for Public Affairs and one Director/Deputy for Legislative Affairs. Pursuing other changes in reporting chains to ensure consistency with the law and administration priorities. The next conservative administration should undertake a comprehensive review of the DOJ's current organizational chart and make decisions about its structure, consistent with any authority to do so outside of congressional action, to ensure the most efficient accomplishment of the department's missions. For example, is the current reporting structure for the Associate Attorney General's office the best and optimal for the achievement of the department's mission? Should all of the Deputy Attorney General's direct reports continue to be direct reports, or would a different structure achieve a better, more efficient outcome in fulfilling the department's mission? What should the Office of Legal Policy's role be in the next conservative administration? Should it continue to be responsible for assisting with judicial nominations, or should that function be assigned to the Office of Legislative Affairs, which interacts with Congress on a daily basis? Pursuing legislative changes for Assistant United States Attorney's compensation. To ensure that the department can attract and retain top legal talent away from Washington, D.C., the next conservative administration should seek congressional reform of the pay scale used for Assistant United States Attorneys in the field. At a minimum, that reform should include a proposal to compensate Assistant United States Attorneys on at least the same basis as attorneys employed by Main Justice who are compensated under the GS scale. Ensuring that the department can attract and retain top legal talent outside of the DC market is essential and will help to emphasize the importance of the field's work in achieving the department's various missions. Protecting the integrity of the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the National Institute of Justice. The DOJ's statistical and research arms should serve the American people and not special interests. The Director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics should focus the BJS on producing the statistics of greatest interest to everyday Americans, and hence of policymakers, rather than those of particular interest to criminal justice academics. The Director should insist that such statistics be as accurate as possible and presented as clearly as possible. The intellectually engaged, everyday American citizen should be able to read and understand the BJS's published statistics and reports rather than having to trust experts because the statistics are not clear. The BJS should focus on the core statistics involving crime and punishment, such as those relating to serious crimes committed, imprisonment, time served, recidivism, and the like. It should not pursue the niche political agendas of academics or advocates. Moreover, a clear line should be maintained between official government statistics and third-party contractor reports. There should be no reports that look like official BJS reports but are authored by private entities such as the Urban Institute as happened under the Obama administration. Research funded by the National Institute of Justice should follow similar principles. The NIJ should fund high-quality, unbiased research on the topics of greatest interest to everyday Americans and policymakers rather than agenda-driven research desired by advocates or academics. The National Crime Victimization Survey, which is the nation's largest crime survey and predates the BJS, it dates to the Nixon administration, is of particular importance, and the department should prioritize and sufficiently fund it. This survey provides the only comprehensive and credible alternative to police reports for showing who commits crimes. The demographic information that crime victims provide through the survey about who commits crimes against them enables such reports as Race and Ethnicity of Violent Crime Offenders and Arrestees, 2018, which was published in January 2021 and finds that police are arresting those who, according to victims, actually commit crimes. Chapter 18. Department of Labor and Related Agencies. Mission Statement. At the heart of the conservative promise is the resolve to reclaim the role of each American worker as the protagonist in his or her own life and to restore the family as the centerpiece of American life. The role that labor policy plays in that promise is twofold: give workers the support they need for rewarding, well-paying, and self-driven careers, and restore the family-supporting job as the centerpiece of the American economy. The Judeo-Christian tradition, stretching back to Genesis, has always recognized fruitful work as integral to human dignity, as service to God, neighbor, and family. And Americans have long been known for their work ethic. While it is primarily the culture's responsibility to affirm the dignity of work, our federal labor and employment agencies have an important role to play by protecting workers, setting boundaries for the healthy functioning of labor markets, and ultimately encouraging wages and conditions for jobs that can support a family. Overview. The labor agencies covered in this chapter include the Department of Labor, DOL, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EOC, the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, the National Mediation Board, NMB, the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, FMCS, and the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, PBGC. Congress has provided these agencies with the authority to enforce a wide range of federal statutes regulating workplace conduct, workforce development, employee benefits, labor organization and bargaining, and international labor conditions. In the sweep of American history, these authorities are relatively new. They largely come from Congress's attempts in the middle of the 20th century to resolve major political questions brought about by labor conflict, the civil rights movement, and the emergence of the modern workplace. The 21st century has brought about new challenges, ranging from collapsing manufacturing sector employment and a decrease in family-supporting jobs, to the massive expansion of an increasingly radical human resources bureaucracy. In many cases, these challenges are as significant as the 20th century labor crises and workplace changes that the agencies were developed to manage. But the agencies have failed to respond to these challenges. Despite significant progress by the Trump administration, a massive administrative state now hangs over productive industry and labor organization, acting as a damper on social and economic life. And under the Biden administration, that administrative state has imposed the most assertive left-wing social engineering agenda in the agency's history and ratcheted up regulatory costs on small businesses and other productive industry. The agency's authorities have been abused by the left to favor human resources bureaucracies, climate change activists, and union bosses, all against the interest of American workers. Needed reforms. Reverse the DI revolution in labor policy. Under the Obama and Biden administrations, labor policy was yet another target of the diversity, equity, and inclusion (DI) revolution. Under this managerialist left-wing race and gender ideology, every aspect of labor policy became a vehicle with which to advance race, sex, and other classifications and discriminate against conservative and religious viewpoints on these subjects and others, including pro-life views. The next administration should eliminate every one of these wrongful and burdensome ideological projects. Eliminate racial classifications and critical race theory trainings. The Biden administration has pushed racial equity in every area of our national life, including in employment, and has condoned the use of racial classifications and racial preferences under the guise of DI and critical race theory, which categorizes individuals as oppressors and victims based on race. Non-discrimination and equality are the law. DI is not. Title VII flatly prohibits discrimination in employment on the basis of race, color, and national origin. The president should issue an executive order banning, and Congress should pass a law prohibiting the federal government from using taxpayer dollars to fund all critical race theory training, CRT. Direct DOJ and EEOC to enforce Title VII. The president should direct the Department of Justice and Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to enforce Title VII to prohibit racial classifications and quotas, including human resources classifications and DI trainings that promote critical race theory. Eliminate EO1 data collection. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission collects EO1 data on employment statistics based on race/ethnicity, which data can then be used to support a charge of discrimination under a disparate impact theory. This could lead to racial quotas to remedy alleged race discrimination. The Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, OFCCP, also has a right to the data EOC collects. And forces individuals into categories that do not fully reflect their racial and ethnic heritage. Amend Title VII. The next administration should work with Congress to amend Title VII to prohibit the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission from collecting EO1 data and any other racial classifications in employment for both private and public workplaces. Eliminate disparate impact liability. With interracial marriages in America increasing, many Americans do not fit neatly into crude racial categories. Under disparate impact theory, moreover, discriminatory motive or intent is irrelevant. The outcome is what matters. But all workplaces have disparities. Congress should eliminate disparate impact as a valid theory of discrimination for race and other bases under Title VII and other laws. Disparities do not, and should not legally, imply discrimination per se. The president should sign an executive order explicitly forbidding OFCCP from using disparate impact in its analysis. Eliminate OFCCP. The Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, OFCCP, exists to enforce Executive Order, EO 11246. That order was originally signed in 1965 to require federal contractors and subcontractors to commit to non-discrimination. It gave enforcement authority to the Department of Labor, up to and including debarment from federal contracting. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has since grown, often making OFCCP's authority redundant and imposing a second regulatory agency under whose rules businesses must operate. In addition, under EO 11246, the President and DL can force a huge swath of American employers to comply with rules and regulations based on novel anti-discrimination theories, such as sexual orientation and gender identity theories, that Congress had never imposed by statute. Rescind EO 11246. The President should eliminate OFCCP by simply rescinding EO 11246. Federal contractors would still be bound by statutory non-discrimination law, but would no longer work under overlapping regimes. Act and Vietnam-era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act, VEVRA, could be enforced by EOC or DOL. Contractors also would be less subject to the changing political whims of a president that might impose significant new costs or burdens on the contractors. Sex discrimination. The Biden administration, LGBT advocates, and some federal courts have attempted to expand the scope and definition of sex discrimination, based in part on the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock v. Clayton County. Bostock held that an employer who fires someone simply for being homosexual or transgender violates Title VI's prohibition against sex discrimination. The court explicitly limited its holding to the hiring/firing context in Title VII and did not purport to address other Title VII issues, such as bathrooms, locker rooms, and dress codes, or other laws prohibiting sex discrimination. Notably, the court focused on the status of the employees and used the term transgender status rather than the broader and amorphous term gender identity. Restrict the application of Bostock. The new administration should restrict Bostock's application of sex discrimination protections to sexual orientation and transgender status in the context of hiring and firing. Withdraw unlawful notices and guidances. The president should direct agencies to withdraw unlawful notices and guidances purporting to apply Bostock's reasoning broadly outside hiring and firing. Rescind regulations prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, transgender status, and sex characteristics. The president should direct agencies to rescind regulations interpreting sex discrimination provisions as prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, transgender status, sex characteristics, etc. Direct agencies to refocus enforcement of sex discrimination laws. The president should direct agencies to focus their enforcement of sex discrimination laws on the biological binary meaning of sex. Pro-life measures. Promote pro-life workplace accommodations for mothers. Federal law should protect life and promote pro-family policies. Current law, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, provides non-discrimination protections in the workplace for pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions. The Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, PWFA, requires employers to make reasonable accommodations for women to the known limitations related to the pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions unless the accommodation would impose an undue hardship on the operation of the employer's business. The Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, also provides non-discrimination and accommodation protections in the workplace for certain pregnancy-related disability. None of these laws requires an employer provide health insurance benefits for elective abortion. Pass a law requiring equal, or greater, benefits for pro-life support for mothers and clarifying abortion exclusions. Congress should pass a law requiring that to the extent an employer provides employee benefits for abortion, it must provide equal or greater benefits for pregnancy, childbirth, maternity, and adoption. That law should also clarify that no employer is required to provide any accommodations or benefits for abortion. Keep anti-life benefits out of benefit plans. Some benefits attorneys and pro-choice advocates have argued since the Supreme Court's Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization decision that the long-standing doctrine of Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, ERISA, 7 preemption should block individual states' efforts to prohibit employers from helping employees procure abortions via offering various kinds of coverage under employee-sponsored benefit plans. ERISA should not be allowed to trump states' ability to protect innocent human life in the womb. Congress and DL should clarify that ERISA does not preempt states' power to restrict abortion, surrogacy, or other anti-life benefits. Religion. Provide robust protections for religious employers. America's religious diversity means that workplaces include people of many faiths and that many employers are faith-based. Nevertheless, the Biden administration has been hostile to people of faith, especially those with traditional beliefs about marriage, gender, and sexuality. The new administration should enact policies with robust respect for religious exercise in the workplace, including under the First Amendment, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993, RFRA, Title VII, and federal conscience protection laws. Issue an executive order protecting religious employers and employees. The president should make clear via executive order that religious employers are free to run their businesses according to their religious beliefs, general non-discrimination laws notwithstanding, and support participation of religious employees and employers as federal contractors and in federal activities and programs. Clarify Title VI's religious organization exemptions. Congress should clarify Title VI's religious organization exemptions to make it more explicit that those employers may make employment decisions based on religion regardless of non-discrimination laws. Provide robust accommodations for religious employees. Title VII requires reasonable accommodations for an employee's sincerely held religious beliefs, observances, or practices unless it poses an undue hardship on the employer's business. These accommodation protections also apply to issues related to marriage, gender, and sexuality. Unless the Supreme Court overrules its bad precedent, Congress should clarify that undue hardship means significant difficulty or expenses, not more than a de minimis cost, as the court has previously held. General EOC reforms. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EOC, does not have rulemaking authority under Title VII and other laws it enforces, yet it issues guidance, technical assistance, and other documents, including some that push new policy positions. More than a de minimis cost, as the court has previously held. General EOC reforms. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EOC, does not have rulemaking authority under Title VII and other laws it enforces, yet it issues guidance, technical assistance, and other documents, including some that push new policy positions. EOC should disclaim its regulatory pretensions and abide by the guidance reforms discussed below. EOC should disclaim its regulatory pretensions. Affirm decision-making via majority vote of commissioners. EOC should affirm as policy the Title VII requirement that it exercise substantive power via majority vote of commissioners, not by unilateral chair action or by delegation to staff. Disclaim power to enter into consent decrees. EOC should disclaim power to enter into consent decrees that require employer actions that it could not require under the laws it enforces. Reorient enforcement priorities. EOC should reorient its enforcement priorities toward claims of failure to accommodate disability, religion, and pregnancy, but not abortion. Refocusing labor regulation on the good of the family. The DI revolution in labor affected not only the administrative state, but it has also targeted much of the private sector. Owing to the combination of regulatory pressure and eager human resources offices in the private sector, much of American labor and employment policy has become institutionally oriented toward woke goals. Retracting regulations that support this revolution is a good first step, but more is needed. We must replace woke nonsense with a healthy vision of the role of labor policy in our society, starting with the American family. Allow workers to accumulate paid time off. Lower and middle-income workers are more likely to be in jobs that are subject to overtime laws that require employers to pay time and a half for working more than 40 hours a week. Congress should enact the Working Families Flexibility Act. The Working Families Flexibility Act would allow employees in the private sector the ability to choose between receiving time and a half pay or accumulating time and a half paid time off, a choice that many public sector workers already have. Are affected not only the administrative state, but it has also targeted much of the private sector. Owing to the combination of regulatory pressure and eager human resources offices in the private sector, much of American labor and employment policy has become institutionally oriented toward woke goals. Retracting regulations that support this revolution is a good first step, but more is needed. We must replace woke nonsense with a healthy vision of the role of labor policy in our society, starting with the American family. Allow workers to accumulate paid time off. Lower and middle-income workers are more likely to be in jobs that are subject to overtime laws that require employers to pay time and a half for working more than 40 hours a week. Congress should enact the Working Families Flexibility Act. The Working Families Flexibility Act would allow employees in the private sector the ability to choose between receiving time and a half pay or accumulating time and a half paid time off, a choice that many public sector workers already have. For example, if an individual worked 2 hours of overtime every week for a year, he or she could accumulate 4 weeks of paid time off to use for paid family leave, vacation, or any reason. Congress should incentivize on-site childcare. Across the spectrum of professionalized childcare options, on-site care puts the least stress on the parent-child bond. Congress should amend the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, to clarify that an employer's expenses in providing on-site childcare are not part of an employee's regular rate of pay. DL should commit to honest study of the challenges for women in the world of professional work. The Women's Bureau at DL tends towards a politicized research and engagement agenda that puts predetermined conclusions ahead of empirical study. The Bureau should rededicate its research budget towards open inquiry, especially to disentangle the influences on women's workforce participation and to understand the true causes of earnings gaps between men and women. Equalize retirement savings access across married households. The limit on individual contributions to a 401k, 403b, or similar work-based retirement account is $22,500 for 2023. Individuals who do not work or do not have access to a work-based retirement account can save up to $6,500 in an IRA. This individual-based system creates a disadvantage for married couples with only one spouse who works, or with 2 working spouses, one of whom earns less than the maximum retirement account contribution. To equalize access to tax-free retirement savings for married couples, the limit for married couples on 401k and similar work-based retirement savings accounts should be double the limit for individuals, regardless of the allocation of work between the couple. Family statistics. Every month, DL's Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys tens of thousands of households to generate detailed estimates of labor market conditions and price levels. And every quarter, the Department of Commerce's Bureau of Economic Analysis estimates the change in the entire economy's output to the fraction of a percentage point. Yet data on the state of the American family and its economic welfare are released at best annually, and generally a year or more after the fact. Metrics like marriage and fertility rates, the share of children living with both biological parents, the cost of a standard basket of middle-class essentials, and the share of families whose highest income worker earns more than twice the poverty threshold should be measured and reported monthly and in real time and incorporated in releases for other labor statistics. Congress should establish an assistant commissioner for family statistics within the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Congress should require the Bureau to establish a pilot survey with a sample comparable to the BLS current population survey that would publish monthly estimates for measures of the American family's well-being, and appropriate sufficient funds for that purpose. Congress should require that the consumer price index market basket include measurable family essential goods. Alternative view. While metrics on the state of American families and civil society are important and useful, monthly statistics would be of little additional value and could end up causing unnecessary confusion and concern. Funding should be oriented towards improving the timeliness of annual family statistics. Sabbath rest. God ordained the Sabbath as a day of rest, and until very recently the Judeo-Christian tradition sought to honor that mandate by moral and legal regulation of work on that day. Moreover, a shared day off makes it possible for families and communities to enjoy time off together, rather than as atomized individuals, and provides a healthier cadence of life for everyone. Unfortunately, that communal day of rest has eroded under the pressures of consumerism and secularism, especially for low-income workers. Congress should encourage communal rest by amending the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, 9 to require that workers be paid time and a half for hours worked on the Sabbath. That day would default to Sunday, except for employers with a sincere religious observance of a Sabbath at a different time, e.g., Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. The obligation would transfer to that period instead. Houses of worship, to the limited extent they may have FLSA-covered employees, and employers legally required to operate around the clock, such as hospitals and first responders, would be exempt, as woodworkers otherwise exempt from overtime. Alternative view. While some conservatives believe that the government should encourage certain religious observance by making it more expensive for employers and consumers to not partake in those observances, other conservatives believe that the government's role is to protect the free exercise of religion by eliminating barriers as opposed to erecting them. Whereas imposing overtime rules on the Sabbath would lead to higher costs and limited access to goods and services and reduce work available on the Sabbath, while also incentivizing some people, through higher wages, to desire to work on the Sabbath. The proper role of government in helping to enable individuals to practice their religion is to reduce barriers to work options and to fruitful employer and employee relations. The result, ample job options that do not require work on the Sabbath so that individuals in roles that sometimes do require Sabbath work are empowered to negotiate directly with their employer to achieve their desired schedule. Teleworking. COVID made telework ubiquitous, but the law and regulations are still stuck in an era when telework was unique. Congress should clarify that overtime for telework applies only if the employee exceeds 10 hours of work in a specific day, and the total hours for the week exceed 40. DL should clarify that an employee given the option to telework need only record time if the quantity of work assigned for that day exceeds the usual amount of work that employee performs so that the employee need not track every time he logs in and out, and the employer need not do so either. DL should clarify that a home office is not subject to OSHA regulations and that time to set up a home office is not compensable time or eligible for overtime calculations. DL should likewise clarify that reimbursement for home office expenses is not part of an employee's regular rate, even if those reimbursements are repetitive, such as for internet or cell phone service. End hour 18, page 590.